Hi, this is Pete Best once again, Beatles' original drummer, and you're listening to Joe Johnson's Beatle Brunch.
Hi, this is Paul McCartney, and you're listening to Beatle Brunch with Joe Johnson.
This is John Lennon.
Hi, this is Cynthia Lennon. And I'm very happy to be here on Joe Johnson's Beatle Brunch.
Hello, this is George Harrison, and if you want a good story on the Beatles, stay tuned to the station.
Hello everybody, this is Ringo Starr. You're listening to Beatle Brunch with Joe Johnson.
Yes, I get by with a little help from my friends, with a little help from my friends.
Sessions, because Richard used to work with Cliff Richard and the Shadows, right? And Richard can't remember much about those sessions, but when we're on these sessions, we remember basically everything, you know? And it's so indelible, and that's how this came about, because when I was working with other artists, they'd say, well, tell us some Beatles stories, and you would, and they'd say, and eventually the Howard Massey, who co-wrote the book, said, I don't know who mentioned it first, well, let's write a book, because I was to actually present, you know, the real story, because most stories are just third hand, right? So anyway, we spent like 5.5, 6 years writing that book, and Richard came from Australia, and my other assistants one came from Canada, another one came from somewhere else, and we sat there for a few days, and Howard actually sort of taped everything, and we'd sit at the table, and oh, do you remember this? And do you remember when she said that? And do you remember when, you know, Yoko grabbed the biscuits off of the, you know, the organ cabinet? So all this started to come to light, you know. I mean, so but Howard's got like cupboardfuls of tapes of all our discussions. We were thinking of actually doing, because of the publishers and the editors, to do a director's cut of that book, because the stuff that was taken out of that book. You know?
I think you should. I think that everybody would be into hearing those stories further.
Yeah.
So, could you detect the you know, I know A Hard Day's Night kind of caricaturized the Beatles, and of course with the 300 girls running in, we saw that throughout the movie as well. Yeah. But could you detect their original four personalities, and can you define them for us just briefly?
Well, I mean, as I said, you know, John. I mean, I'm not anti-John, but John was like he was a great guy, because his mind was such that he, as you know, the Dalai Lama voice for A Day in the Life, for Tomorrow Never Knows. But that's the only way John could describe what he could hear in his head. He wasn't very descriptive of it, but this was something avant-garde from what the normal was. Mm-hmm. And you know, Paul became the musician's musician, because when he was with Jane Asher eventually, you know, and Jane Asher's family were from a classical music family, and Paul sort of latched onto the fact there's more to this than just pop, you know. Mm-hmm. So that was an early development stage with Paul, and I saw it unwind, because also before, when I actually became their engineer on Revolver, I was remastering American records, because I went up the ladder quite fast. And the year prior to doing that, I was remastering all the American records for the European market. Because EMI, I guess, was the distributor of a lot of Tamla and all the hit, you know, American labels.
You mean the Motown stuff?
All the Motown stuff. Right. So what they used to do, believe it or not, to get the records out fast into Europe, if it was a Motown record that was a hit in America, they couldn't send a copy of that tape over to England because of the customs and excise. It took too long. So they actually used to send the 7-inch American disc over. And that someone's job was to actually dub that disc onto a piece of tape with its surface noise, and I would remaster the European version from that copy of the 7-inch single. So there's 2 lots of surface noise, you know.
Yeah.
So it gave me an insight into different sounds on American records. Basically, that was what started it. And Paul used to come up into my room sometimes when I was doing the mastering, and we had like discussions, and that was during. Most of when I couldn't be on their sessions, of course, because I was now in the mastering room, and so he'd come up there and we lunch times and stuff and just talk about music, and we discussed bass sounds and American sounds and so forth. So that's why I tried to introduce something different into the regimented protocol of EMI Studio sounds, especially with the drum mics and so forth, and get more impact out of instruments.
Did you get the impression that John was a fan of Paul's songs and Paul was a fan of John's songs for the ones they didn't write together? I mean, maybe later on. I'm talking about in the early days when I Want to Hold Your Hand and, Paul would come in with Michelle or different songs like that. Did you get the impression that they liked each other and they liked working together?
Yes, absolutely at the beginning, but I know he didn't like Obla Di Obla Da, did he?
Right, yeah, there's a great story on that. But listen, it had a pleasurable ending, obviously, with the way the record came out.
No, I know.
But one less piano to worry about.
Well, that was the great thing with Paul, because his sense of timing, and a lot of that basic track on that, there was like 5 piano tracks just doing that first rhythm track.
But it started as that reggae.
Yeah, and Paul's sense of timing is unbelievable. It's like their sense of timing when they're double tracking vocals. I mean, you do the lead vocal and they can just sing it identically, just in one pass,
But didn't John later, you were able to re-record his recording to a little bit off, so he didn't have to...
Well, John became lazy. I mean, he really did. He just said, why do I have to go down there and sing this vocal again? And there was Ken Townsend, who was in the maintenance department at EMI. He was presented with the fact, is there any way we can actually, do it automatically? And so I know it's a complicated story, but there was a way of doing it. You could actually get the vocal sound you could only do it when you're mixing or doing a 4-track to 4-track copy. It
has to be in record mode,
yeah,
right?
Right. Yeah. So you used to get the original vocal sound ahead of what you were mixing. So you could delay it via a tape machine. You could advance it or retard it. And then you could sort of bring it up there, it'd phase out, and then you'd get the automatic double tracking sound. The reason why it sounds so good now, compared with what you can get now, is the fact because the motors weren't locked on the tape machines, there was a slight drift on the tape. So now, because when people try to do it digitally, it's just completely locked in and it's just a stagnant sound. So you have to do it on analog, on tape to get that sound. I know people are trying to digitally try to recreate that, but I've almost got it right with a guy I work with in Los Angeles, but it's so hard. People say, how do you get that automatic double track sound? It's so easy, you have to do it with tape. Right. And also what came from that was flanging, because Richard Lush, who was my assistant, Richard, we used to see the power supply to the tape machine that had this copy on, had a big power supply on it, and it had a sweep oscillator, not like a little vernier one now. So you could actually go wow like that, and you get this bendy sound, right? Mm-hmm. Especially with a lot of Harrison's guitar sounds. And Richard and I used to sometimes overdo it, and then George Martin would look over us and sort of snarl at us, It's like, well, you can't do that. And Harrison would be smiling and seriously, and because, George was like that, and then George, no, it's too much, and then Richard would sort of back off a bit. But that was the flanging where Richard was able to go on a guitar note, You can't do that now because of little vernier controls,
But also there were, because of the rules at EMI, I mean, you wore a tie and a coat in the beginning days, or actually through most of the Beatles, right?
But we actually had a meeting about that. So after 5:30, we were allowed to take our jackets and ties off.
But you also had a pub right in the building, which is pretty handy, right? A little.
Not then, we didn't.
You didn't then?
Oh, no. All we had was the first microwave ovens, right, which were like that wide and that high. And there was
Did John want you to put his voice through that?
No, right. But these machines, they were the first microwave ovens, and there was like a little vending machine with this little plastic carton with like God knows what was in it, and you put it in there. But one day, one of the engineers put a tin of beans in there. Right?
Oh.
And the whole thing blew up, and they took them out.
So we moved forward about 4 years of you working at EMI at Abbey Road and recording other artists, eavesdropping on Beatles sessions, and then you were invited into the boss's office where you were requested to work directly with George Martin and the Beatles. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah,
and this was in early '66.
Yeah, that's right. I know we sort of jumped the gun here a bit. Yes, that's what happened, because when Norman Smith left, and as you know, he found Pink Floyd, and Norman was like, the first Beatles recording engineer, which George used to rely on so much because Norman had his own band, right? So Norman left and he became a producer, and there was an opening, obviously, for a new engineer to replace him, except most of the engineers there were in their 30s, 40s, 50s. There was one younger engineer, and suddenly I'm this young kid, and there's obviously a lot of discussions behind the scenes that I know nothing about. So suddenly I'm promoted to the recording engineer, which most people rejected. And the first band I took over from Norman was Manfred Mann, because then I did Pretty Flamingo, which immediately became a hit.
You engineered or produced it?
I engineered it, right? So I was working with Manfred Mann and a few of other George Martin artists, and then, so 5 months later, I was called up into the manager's office, and he said, and George was up there, and the manager said, well, George has got something to ask you. And George said, well, do you want to record the Beatles? And I thought, oh my God, and my heart sank, because I'm so young. I thought, I can't do that, And so anyway, I played this little mind game. And there was this little bouncy ball that went backwards and forwards in my head going, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And it kept going on, no. Eventually, I'm thinking, I'm looking at George and so forth, and it ended up on yes. And then 2 weeks later, we started the Revolver album.
Wow.
Yeah.
When they started the Revolver album with you, did they have ideas for all 12 or 14 songs at that time, or did they just come to you with one song at a time?
No, not at all. And the other terrible thing was, because that afternoon, Philip McDonald, who was my other assistant engineer on those sessions, we're setting up the session, and I'm like so nervous and shaking, and I'm feeling awful, right, and sick and everything because of what I'm now about to do.
Because of the decision you made.
Well, yeah. So when they eventually came into the studio, I had a mic. It was number 3 at Abbey Road, right? And you can only get into the studio via the corridor down. You can't. There's no access from the control room into the studio. So they arrived through the door. They're in the studio. They haven't come through the control room. So I've got a mic open up in the studio, and I suddenly heard George Harrison say to George Martin, he said, "Where's Norman?" And I thought, Christ, they don't know I'm taking over as their engineer. And I know there was a nod and a wink between Paul McCartney and George, because Paul knew what was going on, but George Harrison and maybe Ringo had been left out of the loop on this, So I felt really, really terrible. I mean, I felt really nauseous. And anyway, cut a long story short, they were there when we started to talk about the session. They said we don't want that wishy-washy sound anymore. We've heard American records. We've heard this, we've heard that. So it started with Ringo's drums, so I decided, well, the only thing I can do to give them more impact is to close mic all the drum mics, because there was a protocol at EMI, you could only use the high end and you can't come lower than this and so forth. So I brought all the not all of them, there's only 3 involved because of the mixing console. So I brought all the mics down very close to the drums and took the front skin off the bass drum for the first time. And stuffed that sweater, which came from Help, I think, with the 4 necks in it, inside the bass drum, and put the front skin back on the bass drum. And the rules and regulations were you couldn't actually put a microphone closer than 18 inches to a bass drum, because you destroy the diaphragm. So I actually moved it to like 6 inches away. And then, which led, and it was the most amazing drum sound, because I put the whole thing through a piece of equipment called a Fairchild 660, and it was just awesome. But the next day, someone had sort of snitched on me, and there was a big meeting with the management. You want to see what Jeff did last night, And so I was fighting all these things all the time,
But at that point, had you already recorded what you needed, or did they chastise you?
No, we'd recorded it. And of course, the other, not a demand, but John heard his vocal sound as being, we're talking about Tomorrow Never Knows, which is the first track off this album.
It was like April 6th, 1966.
Right. So John's question was, I want my voice to sound like the Dalai Lama, as everyone probably knows, singing on a mountain top, 25 miles away from the studio. So, that's what he actually said. So the thing was, well, how do you create that from nothing? But my saving grace at that time was looking through the control room window and seeing that revolving Leslie speaker from the organ, and I thought, well, if we can get, cut into that circuitry, which Ken Townsend did, and put John's voice through that revolving speaker, that'll give him the sound that he wants. And of course, that's what we did. And John was over the moon with it,
But most people, I guess recording engineers, most people wouldn't know that you can record the opposite way through a speaker.
That's right.
So why is that? Is it the same components going one way to the other?
Well, that was my theory when it got round to the bass things. We're getting off the subject of the vocal sound there, right? So we're going back to, because I was always trying to experiment with getting better bass sounds. Not realizing that part of the problem was the equipment that possibly EMI had installed in their studio, because we were always told it was the best in the world. I knew nothing about American equipment. So one of my theories was, if a bass speaker can push a sound out, another speaker can take it back in, rather than a small microphone taking it in. So that's what we tried with Paperback Writer and Rain.
With the microphones?
With the speaker as a microphone.
Right,
yeah.
got it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you thought you were in trouble for having the mics too close to the drums, did you get into a lot of trouble for
No,
the
I
Leslie
didn't.
speaker?
No, they never found out about that.
Did they read your book?
No, that came out many years after. No, they never really found out about it. But the older engineers were on my back because there was one, which is getting slightly off a Beatles situation here, in number 2 Abbey Road. Again, referring back to American records and sounds, the protocol was that you put all the rhythm section and the brass, and don't forget we're recording stereo, straight stereo, or just 4-track now, and all the strings are on the woodblock floor down at the live end near the control room end. So on this particular session, it was a new band. I think they were called Force West. And they came from Bristol, and it was a huge orchestra with woodwinds and brass and a choir and percussion and everything else. And I decided to put all the strings on the far end, on the dead end, and put all the rhythm section down on the live end. And the next day, just all hell broke loose. Because the other engineer said, we've been recording this way for like 10, 20 years. Why are you changing it? So what's happening now is trying to break down barriers and trying to create something new,
Well, and luckily you had the Beatles to back you and George Martin, right? So you had a little bit of cushion.
Well, that's
with
what
that,
happened with the bass drum situation, because there was a managerial meeting the next day and George Martin was there, and the Beatles said, no, we want this sound. And I know I haven't got the letter now, but I was actually given a letter, a typewritten letter, saying that I could actually use the microphone that close to a bass drum, but only on Beatles sessions. But of course, every other engineer wanted that same sound, so they all started to do it,
So was that the most complicated part of that song, the way it was, the drums were recorded and the way his vocals were recorded, because there's that record is pretty involved?
Oh, absolutely. And then because the first thing was George Harrison's introduction of the tambura on that, right, which is like 4 tamburas, because we're on 4-track, and because everyone's got a single note, and I think we laid on 4 tamburas, different notes, and put it onto 1 track of the second 4-track. And then, of course, the thing was that we all sort of had our own reel-to-reel tape recorders at home. And then there were gaps in Tomorrow Never Knows. And Paul said, I've got an idea. So I think it was the next day or 2 days later, Paul comes in with this plastic bag with these loops on, which were inserted into those gaps in the track. It's almost like a day in the life when no one knew what was going to go in the gaps, except it ended up as those orchestral parts. So Paul has been now experimenting on his own little tape recorder. So what you could actually do when you make tape loops up is the fact that if you disconnect the erase head on the tape machine, the bias current reduces the first recording by like 3 dBs. And you could like do a wine glass and it'd go round. You could play a little guitar note and that would go round, but it wouldn't actually erase the first sound.
It would just record on top of it?
So you're just building up this layer of sounds, which is what everyone refers to like the seagull sounds, which are not seagulls. It was just what happened out of whatever Paul came in. So he had all these loops, and then there was like maybe 8 loops probably, because we only had 8 faders on the mixing console.
You're asking me?
No, right. So what happened was in number 3 control room that day, there's only like 2 or 3 stereo. Yeah, I'm asking you. So 3 tape machines. So luckily, the other studios weren't working that afternoon. So what happened? They commandeered the maintenance engineers to come, because the loops is like a looper tape like that, and you had to try and thread them up on the tape machine and hold them across the heads. So the only way you could do that was with a drumstick or a bottle to put and hold the tension. So they commandeered all the maintenance engineers. There was like 3 in number 2 studio, because we were in number 3 studio. And I think there was a couple of guys down in number 1 studio, and they tie-lined all the feeds from those control rooms up into our control room. So then all of a sudden there's 8 loops playing, and we've got them all on faders, and it's like the first synthesizer, I guess. But suddenly one would disappear, and it would be that the drumstick loop had come off, right? So the only way you could contact someone was to phone up on the telephone and say, my loop's come off, right? So eventually they all, sussed out all the problems with the tape coming up, and So anyway, so that's what happened that afternoon, and we've got our now eight feed the tape loops and mixed them into the second track probably.
And then when all that was done, you go when the album's done. That's when you go back and make the stereo mix and fix the mono mix and all that.
Sure.
So on the song "I'm Only Sleeping," is that the song where George wanted to play guitar backwards, and then they had to flip the tape over, and he had to memorize the notes? And I know you in your book you say that because they wanted to nowadays with Pro Tools or whatever you can flip it.
No, it's easy. Well, I mean, getting back to that backwards thing, what really happened? Was that the time that John? That was the track when John took the tape home.
Well, that's Rain. That's later on. Now you can ask me about that.
Okay, well, okay.
No, that was Rain and later on, but on I'm Only Sleeping, as I recall reading in this and also in Mark's book, that George wanted to play. They wanted him to play the notes backwards so that they would be forward when you flip the tape over.
That's right. So the only way, because the only way of doing that was to find actually where the bar lines were, and the only way you could play it forwards, right?
Right.
And with a grease pencil, which.
I see. So you had to visually do it.
So we marked the bar lines, right? So as the tape's going the other way, George marked.